The sun shone brightly through the massive glass windows of Prestige Motors, making the polished cars gleam like precious jewels. The dealership was known throughout the city as the place where dreams were displayed on four wheels, dreams that came with price tags most people would never be able to afford. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when 12-year-old Andor walked into the showroom. School had let out early due to a teacher conference, and instead of heading straight home, the boy had decided to visit the place he'd been dreaming about for months. Andor had always loved cars. His bedroom walls were covered with posters of exotic vehicles, and he could recite engine specifications the way other kids his age memorized video game cheat codes. Andor adjusted his backpack and zipped up his blue hoodie as he stepped through the entrance. The air conditioning hit him immediately, a welcome relief from the heat outside. He stood for a moment, taking in the sight before him, rows of gleaming vehicles in every color imaginable. To Andor, this wasn't just a car dealership, it was a museum of mechanical art. "Wow," he whispered to himself, his eyes wide with excitement. He walked slowly past a sleek red sports car, careful not to touch it, just admiring its curves and angles. Andor knew the model well. He had read about it in his car magazines. It could go from 0 to 60 in under 3 seconds and had a top speed that would make most highway patrol officers faint. The showroom wasn't crowded. A few well-dressed adults spoke in hushed tones with salespeople in crisp suits. Nobody paid much attention to the young boy who moved from car to car, reading the information cards with deep interest. Andor was well behaved. His parents had raised him to be respectful of other people's property. At the far end of the showroom stood the crown jewel of the collection, a limited edition supercar in metallic blue. Andor couldn't help but gasp. He had only seen this model in magazines and online videos. The boy moved closer, his heart racing with excitement. The car seemed to call to him, and he leaned in to peek through the driver's side window, imagining what it would feel like to sit behind that steering wheel. What Andor didn't notice was the man watching him from across the showroom. Peter Wallace, the newly appointed manager of Prestige Motors, had been with the company for just 3 weeks. He had come from another high-end dealership where he'd built a reputation for boosting sales and keeping a tight ship. Peter believed in catering to a certain type of customer, the type who could actually afford to buy these luxury vehicles. Peter frowned as he watched Andor. The boy was now carefully, almost reverently, touching the door handle of the blue supercar. Peter straightened his designer tie and began walking briskly across the polished floor. In his mind, kids meant trouble, fingerprints on the windows, smudges on the paint, and worst of all, they scared away serious buyers. "Excuse me," Peter said sharply, making Andor jump. "What do you think you're doing?" Andor turned around, a smile still on his face from the excitement of seeing his dream car up close. Hi. I was just looking at this car. It's amazing, isn't it? Did you know it has a hybrid engine system that—" "This isn't a playground," Peter cut him off, his voice cold. "Where are your parents?" "They're at work," Andor replied, his smile fading slightly. "I was just—" "You can't be in here unsupervised," Peter said, looking around the showroom with visible annoyance. "These cars are worth more than most houses." "They're not toys." Andor's face fell, but he tried to remain polite. "I wasn't treating them like toys, sir. I was being careful. I just really love cars, especially this one." Peter wasn't interested in the boy's explanation. He had already sized Andor up, from his average clothes to his worn backpack, and decided he didn't belong in Prestige Motors. Other customers were starting to look their way, which only fueled Peter's determination to remove what he saw as a disruption. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave," Peter said firmly, gesturing toward the exit. "Come back with your parents if they're interested in making a purchase." The humiliation washed over Andor's face like a dark cloud. A couple nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one stepped in to help the boy. With shoulders slumped, Andor turned away from his dream car and walked toward the door, the joy of his afternoon completely crushed by the cold dismissal. What Peter Wallace didn't know, what he couldn't have guessed in a million years, was exactly who this boy was and what storm was about to hit Prestige Motors because of his actions that day. Andor stepped outside the dealership, the bright sunlight a harsh contrast to how dark he felt inside. His hands were shoved deep in his pockets as he walked to a bench near the parking lot. Sitting down, he pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over his dad's contact information. He hesitated. His father was probably in an important meeting right now. Besides, what would he say? "Dad, someone was mean to me today." He wasn't a baby anymore. Inside Prestige Motors, Peter Wallace was already putting the incident behind him. He straightened his tie with a satisfied tug and turned his attention to a middle-aged couple admiring a silver luxury sedan. "That one's a beauty, isn't it?" Peter said, flashing his practiced smile. "Just came in last week. I'd be happy to take you for a test drive." As Peter worked his sales magic, a salesman named Ryan watched from across the showroom. He had seen the entire interaction with Andra and felt a knot in his stomach. Ryan was new at the dealership too, only 6 months in, but he prided himself on treating everyone with respect, regardless of whether they looked like buyers or not. "Hey Lisa," Ryan whispered to a colleague arranging brochures at the front desk. "Did you see what just happened with that kid?" Lisa nodded, her expression troubled. "Yeah, Peter's been doing that since he started. Last week, he practically ignored an older woman in casual clothes who ended up buying that black sports model in cash." "That's not right," Ryan said, shaking his head. "You never know who might be a customer." Back outside, Andra had decided not to call his father after all. Instead, he texted, "Finished at the library early. Can I come see your new business?" The response came quickly. "Of course. Meet me at the main entrance in 30 minutes. Andra smiled for the first time since being kicked out. His dad had been mysteriously excited about a new business venture for weeks, but had been keeping the details quiet. All Andra knew was that it was something to do with cars, his dad's other passion besides his main investment company. 30 minutes later, a sleek black SUV pulled up at the curb. The window rolled down, revealing Andra's father, David Taylor, a man whose warm smile contrasted with his sharp business attire. "Hop in, son," David called out. "I've got something amazing to show you." Andrew climbed into the passenger seat, his earlier humiliation temporarily forgotten in the excitement of his dad's surprise. "So, where are we going?" Andrew asked as they pulled away from the curb. "You'll see," David replied with a wink. "It's something I've been working on for months, and I think you're going to love it." They drove for about 15 minutes, chatting about Andrew's day at school, carefully avoiding any mention of what happened afterward. As they turned a corner, Andrew felt his heart drop. They were pulling into the parking lot of Prestige Motors. "Dad, wait." Andrew began, but David was already parking the car. "Surprise," David said enthusiastically. "Remember that big deal I was working on? Well, Prestige Motors is now part of Taylor Enterprises. I finalized the paperwork last week, but I've been keeping a low profile, observing how things run before I make any changes." Andrew stared at his father, speechless. How could he tell his dad what had just happened? Would his father think he had done something wrong? "What's the matter?" David asked, noticing his son's expression. "I thought you'd be excited. You love cars, and now we own one of the best dealerships in the city." Andrew took a deep breath. "Dad, I was just here. Like an hour ago." David raised an eyebrow. "Oh, what did you think? Did anyone show you around?" "Not exactly," Andrew said quietly. "The manager, he kind of asked me to leave." David's smile faded. "Asked you to leave? Why would he do that?" As Andrew explained what had happened, his father's expression changed from confusion to concern, and then to something Andrew rarely saw, controlled anger. David was known for his calm demeanor in business, but there was a firm set to his jaw now that meant someone had crossed a line. "I see," David said when Andrew finished his story. "Well, son, I think it's time for me to properly introduce myself to the staff at our dealership, don't you?" Andrew recognized the tone. It was the same one his father used when discussing business opponents who had underestimated him. For the first time since being kicked out, a small smile crept onto Andrew's face. "Yes, sir," he said, straightening his shoulders as they got out of the car. "I think it is." As they walked toward the entrance of Prestige Motors together, David placed a protective hand on his son's shoulder. The automatic doors slid open, welcoming them into the air-conditioned showroom where Peter Wallace was still schmoozing with customers, completely unaware that his world was about to turn upside down. The moment Andrew and his father stepped back into Prestige Motors, the air felt different to the boy. Walking alongside his dad, Andra stood taller, no longer the unwelcome visitor, but someone who belonged. David's hand remained firmly on his son's shoulder as they moved across the polished floor. Peter Wallace was in the middle of explaining financing options to the couple interested in the silver sedan when he noticed movement near the entrance. His well-practiced sales pitch faltered mid-sentence as he recognized the boy he had kicked out earlier. But now the kid wasn't alone. He was with a sharply dressed man who carried himself with unmistakable confidence. Something about the pair made Peter's instincts kick in. "Would you excuse me for just a moment?" Peter said to the couple. "My colleague Ryan can continue discussing those options with you." He gestured toward Ryan, who had been hovering nearby, and then quickly made his way toward Andra and his father. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," Peter said with his best customer service smile. "Welcome to Prestige Motors. How can I help you today?" His eyes flickered briefly to Andra, but he pretended not to recognize him. Andra looked down at his shoes, feeling a mix of embarrassment and anticipation. David extended his hand. "David Taylor. And you are?" "Peter Wallace, General Manager," Peter replied, shaking David's hand firmly. "Are you interested in any particular model today, Mr. Taylor?" David's smile was pleasant but didn't quite reach his eyes. "Actually, I'm interested in all of them, Peter. Every single car in this showroom." Peter's smile widened. "A big fish customer, exactly his type." "Well, we have an exceptional selection. Perhaps I could show you." "That won't be necessary," David cut in smoothly. "I'm already quite familiar with the inventory. What I'm really interested in is how this dealership treats its visitors." Peter's smile froze slightly. "Customer service is our top priority at Prestige Motors." "Is that so?" David raised an eyebrow. "My son Andra here might disagree. He visited earlier today and had quite a different experience." The color drained from Peter's face as the connection finally clicked into place. His eyes darted between David and Andra, seeing now the clear resemblance he had missed before. "Your son?" Peter managed, his voice slightly higher than normal. By now, Lisa had noticed the conversation and moved closer, followed by Ryan and a few other employees who sensed something important was happening. "Yes, my son," David confirmed, his voice level but firm. I understand. You asked to leave because you assumed he didn't belong here." Peter swallowed hard. "There must be some misunderstanding. We have policies about unaccompanied minors." "Interesting," David interrupted. "I've reviewed all the dealership policies since finalizing my purchase of Prestige Motors last week, and I don't recall seeing that one." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Lisa gasped audibly. Ryan's eyes widened. The couple looking at the silver sedan stopped their conversation to watch. "Purchase?" Peter stammered, his professional demeanor crumbling by the second. "Yes," David said calmly. "Taylor Enterprises acquired Prestige Motors 8 days ago. I've been observing operations before introducing myself as the new owner. I was planning to do that tomorrow at the staff meeting, but it seems today is a better time." Peter's face had gone from pale to ashen. "Mr. Taylor, if I had known." "If you had known he was my son, you would have treated him differently." David finished the thought. "That's precisely the problem, isn't it?" Andra watched his father handle the situation with the same calm confidence he used in all his business dealings. He felt a surge of pride, but also a touch of sympathy for Peter, who looked like he might pass out. "I believe we should continue this conversation in private," David said, gesturing toward what he knew was the manager's office. "Andra, why don't you ask Ryan to show you that blue supercar you were admiring earlier?" Ryan stepped forward immediately. "I'd be happy to. We can even start it up if you'd like." As David and a visibly shaken Peter walked toward the office, the other employees quickly dispersed, whispering among themselves. Lisa approached Andra with a warm smile. "I'm so sorry about what happened earlier," she said genuinely. "Not all of us here are like that." Andra nodded, appreciating her kindness. As Ryan led him toward the supercar, Andra glanced back at his father disappearing into the office with Peter. He didn't know exactly what would happen next, but he had a feeling things at Prestige Motors were about to change dramatically. Ryan handed Andra a brochure for the supercar. "Your dad seems like a good man," he said. "He is," Andra replied simply. "He always says how you treat people when you think it doesn't matter shows who you really are." Ryan nodded thoughtfully, looking toward the closed office door. That's a lesson some of us here might need to learn. The news spread through Prestige Motors like wildfire. By closing time, every employee knew that David Taylor was their new owner and that Peter had kicked out the owner's son. The showroom buzzed with whispered conversations and nervous glances toward the manager's office, where David and Peter had been talking for over an hour. Lisa was arranging some paperwork at the front desk when Ryan approached, his expression troubled. "Any word on what's happening in there?" Lisa asked, nodding toward the office. Ryan shook his head. "Nothing yet. But I don't think it's going well for Peter. Andrew is still checking out cars with Tom from sales." "I feel bad for the kid," Lisa said. "He was so polite when he came in earlier. Peter didn't even give him a chance." "You know," Ryan lowered his voice, "this isn't the first time Peter's done something like this. Remember that older couple last month? The ones in the work clothes?" Lisa nodded. "The ones he ignored until they mentioned they were buying for their son's graduation." "Yeah, and there was that lady with the accent he practically shoved onto me because he didn't think she was our kind of customer." Ryan made air quotes with his fingers. "Turns out she owned 3 of our cars already." "I almost said something a few times," Lisa admitted. "But I need this job, and Peter made it clear he could fire anyone who didn't do things his way." Their conversation was interrupted when the office door finally opened. David emerged first, his face serious but composed. Peter followed, looking like a man who had aged 10 years in a single hour. His usual confident stride was gone, replaced by stiff, uncertain movements. David spotted Andrew sitting in the driver's seat of the blue supercar, with Tom explaining the dashboard features. With a small gesture, David called his son over. Andrew quickly thanked Tom and hurried to join his father. "Everyone, could I have your attention, please?" David called out. The showroom immediately fell silent as all eyes turned to him. "For those who haven't heard, my name is David Taylor. My company acquired Prestige Motors last week, and I had planned to introduce myself formally tomorrow. Events today have moved up that timeline." The employees gathered around, some looking curious, others nervous. Peter stood slightly apart, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I believe in running businesses where everyone is treated with respect," David continued. "Not just the people who look like they can afford our products, but everyone who walks through those doors. We never know someone's story just by looking at them." He placed his hand on Andrew's shoulder. "My son came here today because he loves cars. The way he was treated is unacceptable, and from what I've heard in the last hour, it wasn't an isolated incident." Several employees shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. Others nodded in agreement. "Starting tomorrow, there will be changes at Prestige Motors," David announced. "I'm calling a mandatory staff meeting at 8 a.m. to discuss our new customer service policies. For tonight, I want everyone to think about how we can make this dealership a place that welcomes all car enthusiasts, regardless of age, appearance, or background." As the staff began to disperse, David turned to Peter. "Mr. Wallace, please be in my office at 7:30 tomorrow morning." Peter nodded stiffly. "Yes, sir." After everyone had gone home and the showroom lights were dimmed, David and Andrew walked around the dealership alone, admiring the cars at their leisure. "Dad?" Andrew asked. "Are you going to fire Peter?" David considered the question carefully. "What do you think I should do?" Andrew thought about Peter's harsh words, how small they had made him feel. But he also remembered something his grandmother always said about people deserving second chances. "I think," Andrew said slowly, "people can learn and change if they want to." David smiled at his son's wisdom. "That's true, but they need to understand what they did wrong first." "Did he understand?" Andrew asked. "I think so," David replied. "He told me some things about his background that helped me understand why he acts the way he does. Not excuses, but context." They stopped in front of a vintage car in the corner of the showroom, a beautifully restored model from the 1960s. "You know, when I was your age, I used to press my nose against dealership windows just like this one," David said. "A kind salesman once invited me in, let me sit in the cars even though he knew my family couldn't afford them. He answered all my questions. That's why I got into this business." "Really?" Andrew looked up at his father. "Really, and someday this will all be yours. What kind of place do you want it to be? Andrew considered the question seriously. A place where anyone who loves cars feels welcome, like that salesman made you feel. David nodded, pride evident in his eyes. Then that's exactly what we'll make it. As they walked toward the exit, David's phone buzzed with a message. He checked it and frowned slightly. What is it? Andrew asked. It's from Mrs. Chen, my assistant. Apparently, there have been other complaints about Peter from customers. She's gathered statements from several people who felt discriminated against here. That sounds bad, Andrew said. It is, David agreed. Tomorrow's meeting just got a lot more complicated. They stepped out into the evening air, the weight of the situation settling between them. The dealership sign glowed behind them, casting long shadows ahead as they walked to their car. Whatever happened tomorrow would reshape Prestige Motors entirely, and they both knew it. The next morning arrived with gray clouds hanging low in the sky, matching the mood of Peter Wallace as he pulled into the employee parking lot at 7:15 a.m. He sat in his car for a few minutes, rehearsing what he would say to David Taylor. After a nearly sleepless night, Peter had realized just how precarious his position was. The dealership was quiet as Peter walked through the showroom toward what was now David's office. He had spent 3 years climbing to the position of manager, and in a single afternoon, he had put everything at risk because of his assumptions about a 12-year-old boy. He knocked on the office door at exactly 7:30. Come in, David's voice called from inside. Peter entered to find David reviewing a stack of papers. The office looked different already. Family photos had appeared on the desk, including one of Andrew sitting on the hood of a classic car, grinning widely. Good morning, Mr. Taylor, Peter said, his voice steadier than he felt. Have a seat, Peter, David replied, gesturing to the chair across from him. I appreciate your punctuality. Peter sat down, his back straight, hands folded in his lap. Mr. Taylor, before you say anything, I want to apologize again for yesterday. My behavior was inexcusable. David studied him for a moment. Yes, it was. But what concerns me more is that it wasn't a one-time mistake. I've been reviewing customer complaints from the past month. He tapped the stack of papers in front of him. There's a pattern here. Peter swallowed hard. I didn't realize. That's part of the problem, David interrupted. You didn't realize how your actions were affecting people, or you didn't care. Either way, it reflects poorly on this business and goes against everything I stand for. I understand, Peter said quietly. I assume you'll want my resignation. David leaned back in his chair. That would be the easiest solution, wouldn't it? For both of us, but easy isn't always right. Peter looked up, confused. My son and I had an interesting conversation last night, David continued, about second chances and learning from mistakes. Andrew surprised me with his compassion. He suggested that firing you might satisfy my anger, but it wouldn't actually solve the deeper problem. Your son sounds wiser than many adults I know, Peter admitted. David smiled slightly. He gets that from his mother. His expression turned serious again. Here's what I'm proposing. Instead of firing you, I'm reassigning you. Reassigning me? Peter echoed. Yes, starting next week, we're launching a new community outreach program. We'll be partnering with local schools to provide automotive education workshops. The program will focus particularly on kids from neighborhoods that don't typically have access to places like this. David slid a folder across the desk. You'll be running it. Peter stared at the folder, then back at David. I don't understand. You want me to work with kids? After what happened? Especially after what happened, David replied. You'll also be taking diversity training, along with all our staff. But in your case, I think hands-on experience will be more effective than any training video. Peter opened the folder and skimmed the program details. This is not what I expected. Life rarely is, David said. The easy path would be to fire you and hire someone with better people skills, but that doesn't address the biases that led to your behavior in the first place. I'm offering you a chance to see beyond your assumptions, Peter. To understand that a kid in a hoodie might grow up to buy 10 cars from you someday, or might be the next engineering genius who designs them. Outside the office, employees were beginning to arrive for the 8 a.m. meeting. The murmur of voices grew louder as people gathered in the showroom. Why would you give me this chance? Peter asked. You don't know me. David stood up. Because everyone deserves the opportunity to be better than their worst moment. Whether you take that opportunity is up to you. Peter rose as well, clutching the folder. I don't know what to say. Say you'll do better, David replied simply. That's all any of us can promise. For the first time since the previous day's confrontation, Peter felt a small weight lift from his shoulders. I will. Thank you. As they prepared to join the staff meeting, David added, by the way, Andrew will be helping with the outreach program on weekends. He's excited about sharing his knowledge of cars with other kids. Peter nodded, accepting this final piece of his redemption journey. He knew working alongside the boy he had humiliated wouldn't be easy, but maybe that was the point. The general meeting went much as Peter expected. David introduced himself properly to the staff, outlined his vision for a more inclusive dealership, and announced the new customer service policies and community outreach program. What Peter hadn't expected was David's public vote of confidence in him. Mr. Wallace will be heading our new community program, bringing his expertise in the automotive industry to young people who might not otherwise get exposure to these opportunities, David told the surprised staff. We all have room to grow, and Prestige Motors will now be a place that encourages that growth for our customers, our community, and ourselves. After the meeting, Ryan approached Peter cautiously. So you're staying? In a different capacity, Peter explained, still processing the morning's events himself. Ryan nodded thoughtfully. The outreach program actually sounds pretty cool. I'd be interested in helping out if you need volunteers. Peter looked at Ryan with new eyes. Yesterday, he would have dismissed this newer, younger salesman as just trying to score points with management. Today, he recognized the genuine offer for what it was. I'd appreciate that, Peter said. I have a feeling I'm going to need all the help I can get. As the staff dispersed to open the dealership for the day, Peter noticed Ander standing near the entrance with a woman who must be his mother. The boy caught Peter's eye and gave a small, tentative nod. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was a start. Peter realized that this chance wasn't just about keeping his job, it was about becoming someone who deserved it. 3 weeks later, Peter stood nervously at the front of Prestige Motors' newly created learning space. What had once been a storage area for extra brochures and display materials was now a bright open room with chairs arranged in a semicircle. Posters showing car engines and design diagrams covered the walls, and a small table held snacks and drinks. They'll be here in 5 minutes, Ryan said, checking his watch. First group from Washington Middle School. Peter nodded, straightening his tie for the 10th time that morning. Is everything ready? The presentation, the handouts. All set, Ryan assured him. And Tom's got the demonstration car ready to show them the engine parts we talked about. This was the official launch of the community outreach program, and Peter felt the weight of it. He had spent countless hours preparing, determined not to let David down after the second chance he'd been given. The diversity training sessions had been eye-opening, sometimes uncomfortable, but Peter had thrown himself into the learning process. The sound of a bus pulling up outside made Peter's heart jump. They're here, he said, unnecessarily. Ryan gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. You've got this. Just remember what David said. Talk to them like future engineers and designers, not just kids. The doors opened and a group of 20 middle schoolers filed in, led by their teacher. They looked around with varying degrees of interest and skepticism. Peter recognized the look on some of their faces, the same careful mask of indifference he'd worn as a kid when entering places where he wasn't sure he belonged. Welcome to Prestige Motors, Peter said, his voice coming out steadier than he expected. My name is Peter, and I'm excited to share the amazing world of automotive design and engineering with you today. A few kids nodded politely, while others continued to look around at the luxury cars visible through the glass partition. Before we start, I'd like to know, how many of you have ever been inside a car dealership like this before? Only 3 hands went up, just as David had predicted. Well, that changes today, Peter continued. And I want you all to know something important. You belong here. Every one of you. Whether your family owns 10 cars or none at all, this place is for anyone who's curious about how these machines work. A boy in the back row caught Peter's eye. He wore glasses and a NASA t-shirt and was practically vibrating with contained excitement. I see we have an enthusiast here, Peter said, smiling at the boy. What's your name? Michael, the boy replied. I've read about all these cars online, but I've never seen them up close. Well, Michael, today you'll get to do more than see them. You'll learn how they work and even sit behind the wheel of a few. Michael's face lit up and Peter felt something unexpected, a sense of satisfaction completely different from closing a sale. This, he realized, was what David had been talking about. The workshop proceeded better than Peter had anticipated. The students were engaged, asking questions he sometimes had to research to answer properly. By the time they moved to the showroom floor to see the engine demonstration, even the most reluctant students were showing interest. As Tom carefully explained how the engine worked, with the hood of a luxury sedan propped open, Peter noticed Anders slipping in through the side entrance. David had mentioned his son would be joining later, but seeing the boy still made Peter's stomach tighten with the memory of their first encounter. Anders walked over and stood quietly beside Peter. Hi, Mr. Wallace. Hello, Anders, Peter replied, surprised by the formal address. Your dad said you might stop by. Anders nodded, watching the students crowd around the car. How's it going so far? Better than I expected, Peter admitted. They're asking great questions. I brought something that might help, Anders said, pulling a folded paper from his backpack. It's a diagram I made showing how electric and gas engines are different. Dad thought it might be useful for your presentation. Peter carefully unfolded the paper to find an impressively detailed comparison chart. You made this? It's excellent. Anders shrugged, but couldn't hide his pleased smile. I like explaining complicated things in simple ways. Peter looked from the diagram to the boy, seeing him truly for the first time, not as the owner's son, not as a kid who shouldn't be touching expensive cars, but as a person with knowledge and passion to share. Would you like to explain this to the group? Peter asked, surprising himself with the offer. Andrew's eyes widened. Really? You'd let me? You clearly know what you're talking about, Peter said. Sometimes the best way to learn is to hear from someone your own age. When Tom finished his demonstration, Peter introduced Anders to the group. The boy was nervous at first, his voice quiet as he held up his diagram. But as he began explaining the differences between combustion and electric engines, his confidence grew. The other students listened attentively, some taking notes. Michael, the enthusiastic boy from earlier, raised his hand. How did you learn all this stuff? My dad taught me some, Anders explained. But mostly I just read a lot and watched videos online. Anyone can learn it if they're interested. Peter watched from the side, feeling an unexpected sense of pride. This was what the program was supposed to be about, breaking down barriers and opening doors that had previously been closed. When the session ended and the students were boarding their bus, the teacher approached Peter. This was wonderful, she said. Most field trips are passive experiences, but you actually got them involved. Even Zach paid attention, and that's saying something. She nodded toward a boy who had seemed disinterested at first, but had asked several questions during Andrew's presentation. We're hoping to make this a monthly program, Peter told her. Different schools each time. Count us in for the next one, she replied enthusiastically. After everyone had left, Peter found himself alone with Anders, who was carefully rolling up his diagram. You did great, Peter said honestly. You have a talent for teaching. Thanks, Anders replied, zipping his backpack. An awkward silence stretched between them. Anders, Peter finally said, I never properly apologized to you for that first day. The way I treated you was wrong, and I'm sorry. Anders looked up, studying Peter's face. My dad says actions matter more than words. Your dad is a wise man, Peter acknowledged. But, Anders continued, your actions today were good, so I accept your apology. It was such a simple statement, delivered with the straightforward honesty that only children seem capable of, but it lifted a weight from Peter's shoulders that he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. Thank you, he said quietly. As Anders headed toward the door where his mother was waiting, he turned back. See you at the next workshop, Mr. Wallace. Peter nodded, realizing that something fundamental had shifted. The road to redemption would be long, but for the first time, he believed he could travel it successfully. 6 months passed, and Prestige Motors had transformed. The once intimidating showroom now featured a future driver's corner with interactive displays where young visitors could learn about cars. Photos from the community workshops lined one wall, showing smiling faces of children from all backgrounds sitting in luxury vehicles and learning about engines. It was Saturday morning, and the dealership was buzzing with activity. David had organized an open house, inviting families from across the city to experience the new, more welcoming Prestige Motors. Balloons decorated the entrance, and staff members wore casual clothes instead of formal suits to help visitors feel more comfortable. Peter checked his watch as he finished setting up the education station. In the past 6 months, he had run workshops for over a dozen schools, and the program had received attention from local news outlets. What had started as a punishment had somehow become the most rewarding work of his career. "Everything ready for the demonstration?" Ryan asked, adjusting a display board showing the evolution of engine technology. "Almost," Peter replied. "Andrew is bringing the final model. He's been working on it all week." As if on cue, Andrew walked in carrying a large cardboard box. At 13 now, he seemed taller than he had been 6 months ago, his confidence having grown along with his height. "Sorry I'm late," he said, setting down the box. "Dad got caught up talking to some visitors outside." "No problem," Peter said, helping him unpack the contents. "How's the model looking?" Andrew grinned. "Perfect. Michael helped me finish the electrical components yesterday." Michael, the enthusiastic boy from the first workshop, had become a regular at the dealership, often joining Andrew after school to work on projects. Their friendship was just one of many unexpected outcomes of the program. The model they extracted from the box was impressive. A scaled-down car engine with removable parts that lit up to show how different systems work together. "This is amazing," Ryan said, examining the intricate details. "You two built this yourselves?" "With some help from Mr. Chen in the science department," Andrew admitted. "But mostly us." Peter remembered how the Andrew he'd first met would have been hesitant to take credit. The boy's growth mirrored his own in many ways. Outside, the sound of a school bus arriving signaled the start of the open house activities. Children from various schools that had participated in the workshops poured into the showroom, many accompanied by parents who looked around with curiosity. David appeared at Peter's side. "Good turnout," he observed, surveying the growing crowd. "Channel 7 is here too. They want to interview you about the program." "Me?" Peter asked, surprised. "You're the one who runs it," David replied. "This was always about more than just selling cars, and people are noticing." Before Peter could respond, a group of visitors approached their station. To his surprise, he recognized a face in the crowd, an older woman who had been one of his first rejected customers before David took over. "Mrs. Wilson," Peter said, feeling a flush of shame at the memory of how he dismissed her. "Mr. Wallace," she replied, her expression neutral. "I saw the article about your program in the paper. My grandson is interested in cars, so I thought I'd bring him by." She gestured to a boy of about 10 who stood beside her, looking up at the displays with wide eyes. "We'd be happy to show him around," Peter said sincerely. "Andrew here is our resident expert on engines. He can explain everything." Andrew stepped forward with a friendly smile. "Hi, what kind of cars do you like?" As Andrew led the boy and his grandmother toward the interactive displays, David gave Peter an approving nod before moving to greet other visitors. The morning flew by in a blur of demonstrations, questions, and conversations. Peter found himself explaining the outreach program to the local news reporter, who seemed genuinely impressed by the initiative. "So, what made you start this program?" the reporter asked, holding a microphone toward Peter. Peter paused, considering his answer carefully. "Let's just say I learned an important lesson about not judging people based on appearances," he replied honestly. "This program is about opening doors that might have been closed before, making sure everyone feels welcome here regardless of who they are or where they come from." By early afternoon, Peter needed a break from the crowds. He stepped outside for a moment of quiet, only to find Andrew sitting on a bench near the entrance, also taking a breather. "Mind if I join you?" Peter asked. Andrew moved over to make room. "It's really busy in there." "It's a good kind of busy," Peter said, sitting down. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching people come and go. It was hard to believe how much had changed since that first confrontation 6 months ago. "You know," Peter said finally, "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm grateful for that day you came into the dealership alone." Andrew looked surprised. Really? Even though you almost lost your job? Especially because of that, Peter replied. It forced me to see things I'd been ignoring about myself. Sometimes we need to be shown our mistakes to learn from them. Andrew nodded thoughtfully. My dad says that's what growing up is all about, learning from mistakes and becoming better. Your dad is a smart man, Peter said, smiling. He also says you've done good work with the program, Andrew added. That's why he's promoting you. This was news to Peter. Promoting me? Andrew's eyes widened as he realized he'd spilled a secret. Oops. I think that was supposed to be a surprise. He's going to make you Director of Community Relations for all his dealerships, not just this one. Peter was speechless. After everything that had happened, a promotion was the last thing he expected. Inside, the buzz of activity continued. From where they sat, Peter could see through the windows to the showroom floor. Michael was demonstrating the engine model to a group of fascinated children. Ryan was helping a family with paperwork. Mrs. Wilson was sitting in a luxury sedan, her grandson pretending to drive. We should probably get back in there, Peter said, standing up. Sounds like there's still a lot to do. Andrew stood as well. You know what my favorite part of all this is? He asked. What's that? Seeing kids' faces when they realize they belong here too. That no one's going to kick them out for just looking. Peter felt the weight of those words, remembering his own actions that first day. That's my favorite part too, he said quietly. As they walked back toward the entrance, David emerged from the showroom to meet them. There you are, he said. Peter, there's someone I'd like you to meet, the superintendent of schools. She's interested in expanding our program district-wide. Peter nodded, ready to take on this new challenge. As he followed David inside, he glanced back at Andrew, who gave him an encouraging thumbs up. 6 months ago, Peter Wallace had been a man who judged people by their appearance and assumed he knew their worth at a glance. Today, he was someone different, someone who had learned that the most valuable lessons often come from the people we're quickest to dismiss. And it had all started with a boy who just wanted to look at cars.